Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our final lesson on Jürgen Moltmann in Plain English by Morrison. We completed Morrison's book, but Morrison, at the end of his book, added a postscript, a single lesson postscript, on the final chapter to Moltmann's book, Coming of God. And Morrison did this because he wants to address the controversial issue of universal salvation. Karl Barth and Jürgen Moltmann have both been accused of teaching universal salvation. Now, Moltmann, quote, declared, "I am not a universalist, but God might be. I am not a universalist, but God might be." Moltmann turns it over to the sovereignty of God. The final decision with regard to universal salvation, it all falls under the doctrine of the sovereignty of God for Moltmann. But the reason that Moltmann is questioned about this, primarily from fundamentalists, it's that his second book, The Crucified God, taught that Christ suffered the hell of God-forsakenness for all humanity, and that the resurrection overcame the hell of God-forsakenness for all of humanity. That's teaching universal salvation. No way around it. It teaches universal salvation. Now, the Southern Baptist Convention, it posits the following. A person is saved by putting their faith in Jesus Christ and the efficacious work of Jesus Christ. Saved by faith alone. That is the Reformation position. That is the position of the Southern Baptist Convention. So, obviously, I'm Southern Baptist. Obviously, I've followed Jürgen Moltmann all of my adult life. Therefore, I have an inner conflict. Because I think his book, The Crucified God, is a tremendous contribution to Christian theology. And I am not a fundamentalist. And so I kind of agree with Moltmann that I am not a universalist, but God just might be. We turn it over to the sovereignty of God. But it's a very controversial issue, obviously. The Southern Baptist Convention teaches salvation through faith in Christ alone. Period. Salvation through faith in Christ alone. That is the Reformation position, and that is the position of the Southern Baptist Convention. Now let's get into the lesson, because I'm glad that Morrison added this postscript. He wants to end with the controversial issue regarding Moltmann, because he's been very affirming of Moltmannian theology through the whole book. But he wants to close out with this issue that it is a source of contention, primarily with fundamentalists, not necessarily with Southern Baptists, but fundamentalists can't stand Karl Barth. Fundamentalists cannot stand Jürgen Moltmann. So primarily the contention and the criticism comes from fundamentalists. Let's go to block 1. Understanding eschatology within the context of the cross. Christ suffered the torments of hell for us. Isaiah 6:3, the whole earth is filled with his glory. We expect the coming of a new heaven and a new earth. In the cross, Christ suffered the torments of hell and God-forsakenness, so that for us, we are no longer hopeless. Psalm 139:8, if I make my bed in hell, thou art there. A Christological universalism is revealed. A universalism of the cross is revealed by God in Christ. Christ, and on the cross, is the establishing of our personal eschatology. It becomes our true beginning. The cross is our eschatological beginning. It is an eschatology in hope. It is a promised new beginning. We look for the signs of the dawn of God's coming. We look for the coming of God. We look for the parousia. So block 2, what are the characteristics of Moltmann's eschatology? There are 7. Moltmann's eschatology is Christological. It is centered in Christ's history. It is integrative. It embraces the entire universe. It is redemptive. The coming of God brings an end to sin. It brings an end to death. It is progressive, beginning with Christ's resurrection unto the time when God will be all in all. It is theocentric. It anticipates God's unrestricted presence. It is contextual. It's bound to the influence of history and our historical reflection. And it is politically responsible because Moltmann's eschatology does not remain in the theoretical realm. We must take up praxis, action, and reflection within mission. Moltmann says we must take up praxis. And that was picked up by Gustavo Gutierrez in his book, A Liberation Theology. Moltmann says, our eschatology cannot remain theoretical. We must take up the praxis of action and reflection in the midst of mission. It is a divine eschatology within the context of God's glorification and God's self-glorification, self-realization, and fulfilled interpenetration of all creation, until God will reach and creation will reach the feast of eternal joy. Eventually we will reach the feast of eternal joy. So block 1, we learn that Moltmann posits a universalism of the cross, where the torment of hell and abandonment has been overcome in the cross and resurrection. In block 2, we got the 7 characteristics of his eschatology, and now we close out with that question of universal redemption in block 3. What about personal eschatology and God's faithfulness? What about personal eschatology and God's faithfulness? Moltmann proposes a universal redemption, a universalism of the cross. In the end, God will be all in all. Jesus will judge, but not condemn. We are to trust in God's sovereignty, which is all-embracing. The faithfulness of God is at stake here, says Moltmann. The image of God in us is relational, and God's relationship to us is unchanged. Universalism is based on the Christ who suffered the descent into hell, the descent into God-forsakenness. This is the Christ who was raised up. The certainty of reconciliation is without limits, says Moltmann. The certainty of reconciliation of all creation is without limits. As I said before, Moltmann bases his universal reconciliation, his universalism of the cross, he bases it on his teaching in The Crucified God, his second book, that Christ suffered the God-forsakenness of hell on the cross. When Christ declared, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Christ suffered God-forsakenness, God-abandonment in hell. It has been taken up into the cross of Christ. And in the resurrection of that same Christ, that descent into hell is conquered and defeated for all humanity. For Moltmann, Christ is the Son of Man who takes up all of humanity into the cross. Jesus is Son of Man taking up all of humanity in the cross. In other words, you're only saved by being en Christos, as Paul says, but for Moltmann, all of humanity is in Christ. All have been taken up en Christos because Christ suffered God-forsakenness and the descent into hell on the cross, and that same Christ was raised up, and that defeated the condemnation of the abandonment in hell. Very controversial. Fundamentalists can't stand Karl Barth. Fundamentalists can't stand Jürgen Moltmann. And primarily because they both, even though neither one declared that they believed in universalism, because Barth basically said the same thing as Moltmann. I am not a universalist, but God might be. Barth and Moltmann both said the same thing. They turned it over to the sovereignty of God, saying, God will settle that question. in the end. But they taught a position of universal reconciliation. Barth taught it and was accused. It became a controversial issue, and Jürgen Moltmann teaches it, and it is a controversial issue, primarily criticism from fundamentalists, not really from Southern Baptists. I mean, Southern Baptists invite him to lecture. Waco, the religion department at Waco invited Jürgen Moltmann years ago to do a series of lectures at Baylor University, a Southern Baptist university. So Southern Baptists aren't really critical of Moltmann, but fundamentalists are extremely critical of Moltmann, especially in this area of controversy over a universalism of the cross. So that's really just a very short final postscript. We'd finished the book on Jürgen Moltmann in plain English, but Morrison, and I'll credit Morrison, he did add this controversial postscript just to let people know that there is an issue with Moltmann's book, The Crucified God, and there is an issue, especially from the criticism of fundamentalists on Moltmann's universalism of the cross. That's the final postscript, so, I mean, we're done and completely done with Jürgen Moltmann in plain English. But we had to take a look at this final chapter in The Coming of God and this final controversial issue on Moltmann's teaching on a universalism of the cross. That's going to wrap up our study, including the postscript on Jürgen Moltmann in plain English.